Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate you inviting me on again. It's been a couple years at this point. I think the last time I was on was during the COVID time frame, 2020, I believe. So it's such an honor and a privilege to be back to speak to you all. We're going to be talking about a series of maps tonight, and we're going to be descending back down into the Longstreet at Gettysburg controversy, which is now over 160 years old at this point. So without further ado, I'll get into it. And then, of course, at the end of the presentation, I'll take any questions or comments you have, and I'll address those. So with that, let's get started with it. So by the year 1887, the Longstreet-Gettysburg controversy had already been raging for some 15 years. In the decade and a half since former Confederate Lieutenant General Jubal Early formally opened the controversy in January 1872, suggesting that Army of Northern Virginia First Corps Commander James Longstreet had been ordered to attack the Federal left at dawn on the second day, most of the major allegations against Longstreet's performance had already been made there between 1872 and 1887. These allegations included the following. The major ones are as follows: that Longstreet was slow to reach the field on July 1st, that he sulked and dragged his feet throughout the second day's battle because Lee chose not to adopt his tactical suggestions on the evening of July 1st and early morning of July 2nd. He purposefully delayed and attacked too late on July 2nd. He disregarded orders to prepare to resume the attack at daylight on July 3rd, and he did not enter into the spirit of the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble attack, and therefore deliberately limited its execution. Those are the major charges against Longstreet. In 1877, half a decade after Early first advanced his Sunrise attack claim, Longstreet began to publicly contest Early, Pendleton, and some other ex-Confederates' claims about his Gettysburg performance. One of the Gettysburg-related public writings that Longstreet produced was for the Century Company's Battles and Leaders of the Civil War series, which he titled Lee's Right Wing at Gettysburg. This article, published in February 1887, again largely addressed the continued criticisms of his Gettysburg performance. However, on this occasion, he also advanced a rather curious and unique suggestion for how these criticisms might be effectively addressed, heretofore unexplored. Toward the end of his 16-page article, Longstreet proceeded to reflect on the overarching coverage of the battle, observing that, quote, facts connected with this battle have been so distorted and misrepresented, unquote. To combat this troubling trend, Longstreet suggested the production of a volume of distinct maps, as he called it, of key points in the battle that would serve to make a demonstration to the letter of all its features. To the detriment of the historical record on this long-standing controversy, Longstreet's pointed suggestion has not been directly taken up by scholars, while several inaccuracies of Longstreet's time have persisted into modern-day studies and the collective consciousness of historical memory. However, this presentation will explore the suggestion using 7 distinct battle maps covering all 3 days of the battle as tools to thoroughly address some of the most persistent misrepresentations of Longstreet's Gettysburg performance. So without further ado, see if I can move the slide. There we go. We'll get started with the first map. This is going to cover the first day of the battle. When it comes to allegations of Longstreet's general slowness at Gettysburg, allegedly born out of Longstreet's reaction to Lee's rejection of his tactical suggestions, scholars almost always start with the evening of July 1st. They typically employ a 1905 account from James Power Smith, who served as an aide to Confederate Second Corps Commander Richard S. Ewell at the battle. Smith recalled having reported to Lee on the evening of July 1st, just as the Confederate High Command was considering a follow-up attack on the Federals then regrouping on Cemetery Hill. As the account goes, Smith claimed that Second Corps Division commanders Jubal Early and Robert Rhodes believed Cemetery Hill could be taken if the attack was supported by Lieutenant General A.P. Hill's Third Corps. Despite having other units, some of them fresh, readily available and in the immediate vicinity, to precipitate such an attack, like Early's, Edward Johnson's, William Dorsey Pender's, and Richard H. Anderson's divisions, Smith alleged that Lee immediately turned his attention to Longstreet and asked his senior subordinate whether his men had arrived on the field. Longstreet then supposedly pointed to some dust rising in the distance and replied that his divisions were 3 or 4 miles in our rear, while offering to push up his 2 leading brigades with all possible haste, if necessary. According to Smith, Lee then said, quote, he regretted that his people were not up to support him on the right, but he wished him, Ewell, to take Cemetery Hill if it were possible, unquote. It's important to note again that Lee allegedly said this while seemingly ignoring the availability of some of Hill's corps to facilitate or support such an endeavor against Cemetery Hill. Over the years, historians have framed Lee's statement here as some sort of valid rebuke of Longstreet, using it to further their claims about his alleged obstinance, slowness, and dragging of feet. The First Corps had very good reason to be unavailable at that time, considering they had spent the entire day on the bottleneck Chambersburg Pike. This first map clearly depicts much of the Confederate Army's frustrating situation on that road during the first day's fight. After learning from Longstreet's spy, Harrison, on June 28th that the van of the Federal Army of the Potomac was already located at Frederick City, now Frederick, Maryland, Lee, in the early morning hours of June 29th, aborted his orders to have Ewell march on Harrisburg, and instead issued his initial marching orders to Ewell at Carlisle to concentrate at Chambersburg. And what would ultimately produce an unfortunate situation for the Army of Northern Virginia a few days later, Ewell acted promptly, ordering Edward Johnson's division, which was bringing up the Second Corps' rear, to about face and return at once to Chambersburg. Later on the 29th, after reconsidering his plans, Lee issued new orders, ordering Ewell to concentrate at Cashtown or Gettysburg, which is where the remainder of the Second Corps began marching toward, Rhodes' division moving south from Carlisle and Early's west from York. Lee's decision to change plans on June 29th would have serious consequences for the Confederates' march along the Chambersburg Pike on July 1st. As events turned out, Johnson's division and Ewell's long wagon train, apparently some 14 miles in length, ultimately marched west and south through Shippensburg, Green Village, and Scotland, only to collide with Hill's and Longstreet's corps on the morning of July 1st at the Chambersburg Pike intersection in Greenwood. Lee and Longstreet were together at that moment, and it was then Lee who instructed Longstreet to allow Johnson's division and the Second Corps wagon train to pass first, further delaying the advance of Longstreet's men. This quandary on the Chambersburg Pike delayed 2 of Longstreet's divisions for several hours, impeding Major General Lafayette McLaws's division from reaching Marsh Creek, about 3.5 miles from the battlefield, until near the midnight hour, while Major General John Bell Hood's division filtered into the same bivouac soon thereafter. McLaws's and Hood's divisions resumed their march toward the battlefield before dawn on July 2nd, with Hood reaching the field around sunrise and McLaws's during the 8 a.m. hour. Given Lee's unorthodox order for Major General George Pickett's division to remain at Chambersburg to guard the Army's wagon trains and rear, a duty typically reserved for cavalry, not infantry, Pickett's division did not arrive near the field until the late afternoon or early evening hours of July 2nd. Therefore, as this first distinct map demonstrates, any statement Longstreet made to Lee on the early evening of July 1st about his corps' unavailability would have been patently obvious to Lee. In fact, it was Lee himself at Greenwood who told Longstreet to let the Second Corps units have the right of way. Contrary to what has either been alleged or insinuated in past scholarship, neither Longstreet's statement to Lee nor his corps' whereabouts on the evening of July 1st had anything to do with tactical disagreements, some kind of innate slowness on Longstreet's part, or the First Corps commander's alleged reluctance to attack the next day. And with that, let's move into the next day, July 2nd. This map is all about the plans for July 2nd. There were a couple and they changed, and we're going to look into that in depth. Second map in this series covers a lot of important ground in just one picture. Not only does it address the long-standing criticism that Longstreet should have attacked earlier on July 2nd, the typical allegation suggesting sometime in the morning hours, but it also draws attention to the potential complications of such a morning attack, fully depicting the initial attack plan for McClaw's and Hood's divisions, the last-minute altered plan, and Lee's attempt to achieve concert of action between Confederate corps on the second day. In the post-war years and extending well into the 20th century, Longstreet critics attempted to find a scenario whereby the First Corps commander could have attacked Little Round Top much earlier, perhaps in the morning hours. In the estimation of these post-war writers and historians, Lee identified Little Round Top as the key position on the battlefield early on July 2nd and was determined to seize it during a Confederate attack. Naturally, then, they alleged, if only Longstreet had attacked earlier, he would have found Little Round Top largely unoccupied, except for some Federal signalmen stationed on its western face. The rationale behind modern historians' continued speculation that Longstreet could have or should have attacked in the morning hours is a bit harder to pin down. Although the Little Round Top argument has continued to rear its head for some time, it was actually settled long ago. The fact of the matter is that there is no indication Lee ever identified Little Round Top as the key position on the southern end of the battlefield in the lead up to the second day's attack. Nor is there indication Lee ordered Longstreet to seize it on July 2nd. Lee's official battle reports confirm that his objectives on July 2nd, as labeled on this map, were first, the Joseph Sherfy Peach Orchard, second, Cemetery Ridge, and third, Cemetery Hill. These objectives stem from intelligence Lee and the Confederate High Command had received on the morning of July 2nd from reconnoitering officers who inaccurately reported there was no major Federal force located south of Cemetery Hill. Lee's decisions and orders throughout the day, especially his repeated instruction to attack up the Emmitsburg Road in the afternoon, indicate that he continued to act on this misleading intelligence right up until the moment Longstreet's assault commenced around 4:30 p.m. This map also exposes how a morning attack by Longstreet would very likely have run into unforeseen complications. Contrary to what Lee had been told and was acting on in the morning hours, the Federal left at mid-morning was not located near Cemetery Hill, but was anchored just north of Little Round Top. We know that as early as 8:30 a.m., when Lafayette McLaws arrived with his division and met with Lee and Longstreet, the commanding general was already insisting that once McLaws reached his attack jump-off point, he form his division and attack perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road, aiming towards Cemetery Hill. Now, what might a Confederate assault with that attack orientation, perpendicular to the Emmitsburg Road, look like if executed any time before Federal Major General Daniel Sickles moved his corps from Lower Cemetery Ridge out to the Peach Orchard and its surrounding environs sometime between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Avoiding the pitfalls of what-if history, we can at the very least say that either the Confederates would have been forced to make significant changes to their attack plan, or if left unaltered, face a sizable threat to their right flank as Longstreet's columns attacked up the Emmitsburg Road in front of multiple Federal corps. Of course, one can also easily dismiss the speculative scenario of Longstreet attacking any time in the morning hours upon understanding a few fundamental things on the Confederate front during that time frame. 11 a.m. 11 a.m. is the time all scholars and students of the battle should start with when determining if such an alternate attack scenario is reasonably valid. Indeed, 11 a.m. was the time when Lee first issued Longstreet orders to begin his march to the extreme Confederate right. Before that time, Lee had been weighing his options, still determining if he wanted to initiate the day's attack from Longstreet's or Ewell's front. In addition, there were numerous reconnaissance efforts still ongoing throughout the morning hours, to include one headed by Captain Samuel Johnston to locate a concealed marching route for Longstreet's column to the right. The hourglass of time between 11 a.m. and noon also quickly runs out when one understands what happened after Lee issued Longstreet's order. In addition to the continued absence of Pickett's entire division, Longstreet was without 1/8 of his two divisions' fighting force at 11 a.m. Brigadier General Evander Law's brigade of Hood's Corps was still en route to the battlefield, enduring a 24-mile march from New Guilford. Longstreet asked Lee if he could wait for Law's arrival before beginning his march. Lee consented to Longstreet's request, and with that assent went the morning. This map also depicts the Confederates' initial July 2nd attack plan on the southern end of the field, along with their last-minute altered plan. As evidenced in accounts of Longstreet's interactions with several of his subordinate officers, such as McLaws and Brigadier General Joseph B. Kershaw, toward the end of his column's march to the right, Longstreet was looking to get his attack online quickly, while reassuring subordinates that they would meet little to no resistance in their immediate front. Coupled with these revealing interactions was Lee and Longstreet's repeated insistence that McLaws initiate his attack almost immediately after his division reached its attack jump-off point near Pitzer's schoolhouse, almost immediately. The rapidity of this particular order issued before Lee and Longstreet recognized there was a sizable federal force in their front, not only extending south of Cemetery Hill, but right in their front at the Peach Orchard, is supremely revealing, since it suggests that the Confederates' initial plan was an in-depth attack up the Emmitsburg Road, with McLaws leading and Hood in support. Of course, this initial plan was not to be. As the map shows, once Lee and Longstreet caught onto the situation in their front, they siphoned off Hood's division from behind McLaws' command and over to its right. With this move, Longstreet's attack was already modified with great consequence from a two-division deep attack to a two-division wide attack with no rearward support. Further note that as the map indicates, this altered attack plan was fashioned in perhaps just 1 hour's time, between about 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. The last significant feature of this map depicts the part of Lee's July 2nd attack plan that was never altered. Lee envisioned concert of action between all three Confederate corps on July 2nd, with Longstreet heading the main assault on the right, supported by A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps in the center, and Ewell's 2nd Corps on the left. In the case of Hill's Corps, Lee intended for Richard H. Anderson's entire division to continue Longstreet's attack northward up the line once McLaws' division was fully engaged. There's also indication that the door was left open for Hill to employ additional units, like Pender's and Henry Heath's divisions, if the situation so warranted. In addition to support from Hill, Lee also intended for Ewell's Corps to engage in a simultaneous demonstration with Longstreet's assault to be converted into a real attack, again, simultaneous with Longstreet's, if the opportunity presented itself. As we'll explore later in this presentation, both Hill and Ewell failed to carry out Lee's intended concert of action on July 2nd. Moving ahead to our next map on July 2nd, there's quite a bit going on with this map. However, its purpose is very simple and essentially twofold. First, to demonstrate how Lee and Longstreet's orders going into Hood's attack almost immediately went awry due to a combination of actions and decisions made by John Bell Hood, Evander Law, and Colonel William C. Oates of the 15th Alabama Infantry Regiment. And second, to expose the extent to which the location of Sickles' extreme left flank impacted the execution of Longstreet's July 2nd attack. To begin, recall the infamous exchange between Longstreet and Hood in the lead up to the Confederate attack. Hood had sent scouts around Big Round Top to see if there might be a more opportune way to attack the Federal left on the afternoon of July 2nd. In a series of follow-on interactions with Hood's aides, and even with Hood himself, Longstreet made it clear that there was no time for such a move and that General Lee's orders were clear: attack at once up the Emmitsburg Road. Hood conceded the matter, however, did he really? In an exchange with the 1st Texas's Colonel Philip Work in the minutes leading up to the attack, Hood was alleged to have said, quote, "Very well, when we get under fire, I will have a digression," unquote. Hood was wounded, as the map shows, near the Reverend Michael Bushman farm about 30 minutes into the fight, so we really do not know the full extent to which Hood intended to pursue his alleged digression. That said, within that first half hour of the attack, and from his position near the Bushman farm, Hood would have easily been able to view Evander Law's Alabama Brigade step off Warfield Ridge to his right. he very likely would have also seen how the left of Law's brigade failed to step off in the general direction of the Emmitsburg Road, or obliquely toward where the Federal main infantry lines left, then rested on Houck's Ridge at Devil's Den, but instead marched essentially due east toward the Round Tops. Not nearly stressed enough in Gettysburg historiography is the fact that when Longstreet's attack began, Sickles' left actually did not end with the 4th Maine Regiment and James E. Smith's battery at Devil's Den, but extended well south of that location to where several companies of Lieutenant Colonel Homer Stoughton's 2nd U.S. sharpshooters were positioned between the John Slider Farm Lane and Bushman Hill. You see that there on the map. When explaining the movement of the majority of Law's brigade, most historians have mistakenly contended or implied that the Confederates' advance toward the Round Tops was expected as a matter of course. In reality, no orders had been issued to seize the Round Tops, to advance in their direction, or to scale them. To the contrary, as the map's lines labeled with a 1 indicate, they had actually been ordered to attack obliquely northward up the Emmitsburg Road. Law's initial engagement with Stoughton's sharpshooters occurred by way of 5 companies from the 47th and 48th Alabama regiments that were sent out as skirmishers. These skirmishers proceeded to push Stoughton's men back toward Big Round Top before moving around to the hill's southern face, and then around to its eastern side. Colonel William C. Oates's 15th Alabama Regiment followed in these skirmishers' wake, with Michael Bolger's 47th Alabama guiding on Oates' left. As the line labeled with a 2 shows, Oates received a curious order from Evander Law while engaging and continuing to follow the 2nd U.S. sharpshooters toward Big Round Top. Law's order was not what you might predict, perhaps a directive to change course and direct the majority of his regiment obliquely northward in accordance with Lee's and Longstreet's orders? No. As it turned out, Law's order was more in line with Hood's alleged digression, instructing Oates to proceed toward the ravine or saddle between the Round Tops. As Oates admitted in his official battle report, and as is labeled with a 3 on the map, he disregarded that order and continued to direct his regiment further to the right and towards Stoughton's retreating sharpshooters and Big Round Top. Soon enough, Oates found himself on the summit of Big Round Top, nowhere near the other half of his brigade, Houck's Ridge, Smith's Battery, the 4th Maine Regiment, let alone the Emmitsburg Road. Astoundingly, once on Big Round Top, Oates was ordered by Law, now in command of the division, to proceed north and seize Little Round Top, only to argue to remain on Big Round Top and bring up artillery to shell the smaller hill, where Federal troops were now located. Perhaps even more astoundingly, whereas Oates deemed it necessary to chase Stoughton's men up Big Round Top with his entire regiment in tow, and the 47th Alabama to boot, he deemed it sufficient to detach only 1 company to protect his flank from the retreating sharpshooters once he commenced his move toward Little Round Top. So if it was not already obvious, what's the point of all this rather detailed commentary? The point is the existence of Sickles' extended line by way of the 2nd U.S. sharpshooters, coupled with Hood's alleged decision to pursue a digression from Lee's and Longstreet's orders, along with Law's and Oates' subsequent orders and actions, collectively stretched Longstreet's assault over a much broader front and into areas that the Confederate High Command neither intended nor imagined at the outset. This rightward movement, precipitated by a portion of Evander Law's brigade on the extreme right, ultimately served to pull at the seams of Longstreet's assault, already hampered by no rearward support, and caused repercussions all the way up the Confederate battle line. Take a look at the map and compare the actual attacks to the intended attack orientation. The divergence would become even more severe as McClaw's division got online around 5:30 p.m. As a result of this collective rightward drift, much of Longstreet's assault would become bogged down in a slugfest in the wheat field. Of Longstreet's 8 brigades that attacked on July 2nd, 7 were expended south of the Wheatfield Road, while only 1, William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, attacked north of it, single-handedly managing to seize the peach orchard as intended. before setting its sights on Lee's second objective, Cemetery Ridge. Moving into our next map, we're going to cover Richard H. Anderson's, his division's attack. This map might be more appropriately called Confederate Concert of Action Part 1, as we'll use it to discuss the extent to which A.P. Hill's Third Corps afforded the support intended for Longstreet's July 2nd assault. As the map shows, after helping to seize the Peach Orchard, 3 regiments of William Barksdale's brigade, the 18th, 13th, and 17th Mississippi, moved against the Federals' attempt to reconstitute their line just east of the Emmitsburg Road Trossel Lane intersection. In so doing, however, these 3 Confederate regiments were forced to wheel right and resume their attack eastward toward Cemetery Ridge as a result of a new development on the field. That new development was Richard Anderson's Third Corps Division, to Barksdale's left, which was now online and supporting Longstreet's attack as Lee had intended. Though Lee afforded Longstreet Anderson's division as a kind of substitute in lieu of Pickett's division, Longstreet was never given actual command of Anderson's men on July 2nd. Rather, the division remained under A.P. Hill's charge. We need not become weighed down in the tactical particulars of Anderson's attack. Not only are they shown in great detail on the map, but suffice it to say, for the purposes of this examination, and to stick to the map's main point, we need to maintain focus on 3 things. 3 things. Who attacked north of Barksdale's brigade, who did not, and where the principal Confederate commanders were located on the field. As events turned out, only 3 of Anderson's 5 brigades fully attacked on the afternoon of July 2nd. Cadmus Wilcox's Alabama, Edward Perry's Florida, now under David Lang, and Ambrose Wright's Georgia Brigade attacked in echelon along the Emmitsburg Road, with Wilcox and Lang's commands successfully clearing the remainder of Sickles's men from the Emmitsburg Road ridge, while elements of Wright's brigade managed to achieve a brief foothold on Cemetery Ridge, just south of the infamous copse of trees. Despite this initial success, the Confederate brigades in this sector were forced back one by one. Where was the support to these brigades? Well, first, as was the case with Longstreet's 2 divisions, notice there was no rearward support available to Anderson's men. Attacking over almost as broad a front as Longstreet's, and not with 2 divisions, but only 1, Anderson was already operating at a serious disadvantage, especially if 1 or more parts of his command happened to achieve some success against the Federal center, as was the case with Wright's brigade. There would be little to no immediate support available if there was a breakthrough. In addition, as the map demonstrates, Anderson's attack ended with Wright. Anderson had 2 additional brigades, Carnot Posey's and William Mahone's. However, Posey only partially advanced as far as the William Bliss farm, and Mahone failed to budge at all throughout the attack. So what happened? Wilcox, Lang, and Wright all asked for support during their attacks, Wilcox a total of 3 times. A frustrated Wilcox later alleged that one of his aides found Anderson and his staff sprawled out on the ground behind Confederate lines. For Anderson's part, the division commander claimed he could not find Hill to ask about support. That said, Anderson apparently did attempt to get Mahone to advance. However, when presented with the order, Mahone oddly claimed that he already had orders from Anderson to remain where he was. What about the Confederate High Command? Where were they located on this portion of the field? Recall, Longstreet was not in command of Anderson's division. Following the advance of Barksdale's and Wofford's brigades, Longstreet was likely located somewhere in the vicinity of the James Warfield House along the Millerstown Road. To the north, as Anderson's division commenced its attack, not only were the division commander, Anderson, and the corps commander, Hill, located on this front, but so was the commanding general, Robert E. Lee, himself. Arthur J. Fremantle, a British Army officer and Battle of Gettysburg observer, also present on this part of the field during the Confederates' July 2nd attack, wrote of Lee, quote, "So soon as the firing began, General Lee joined Hill just below our tree, and he remained there nearly all the time, looking through his field glass, sometimes talking to Hill, and sometimes to Colonel Long of his staff. But generally he sat quite alone on the stump of a tree. What I remarked especially was that during the whole time firing continued, he only sent one message and only received one report, unquote. That's Fremantle. Anderson's partial attack is an interesting conundrum in Gettysburg historiography. Over the decades, much more has been made of Longstreet's alleged shortcomings in the lead up to and during his July 2nd attack than has been made about Anderson's limited assault to his north. Clearly, the intention was for Anderson and Hill to commit all 5 of Anderson's brigades to the attack. However, only 3 were ever pushed forward against the Federals' Cemetery Ridge line. We may never know the complete story behind why this oversight or failure occurred on Anderson and Hill's front. But it begs the question, how do you think many past historians would have treated Longstreet in their narratives had he held back 2 entire brigades from his attack? Moving on to map 5, the end of Longstreet's assault on July 2nd, the late evening hours here. This 5th map depicts the end of Lafayette McLaws' attack around 7:30 p.m. on July 2nd. It was at this location in the Plum Run Valley between Houck's Ridge and Little Round Top where most of Longstreet's attack, minus Barksdale's brigade, fizzled out on the second day. With the advance of William Wofford's brigade, Longstreet's last fresh unit on the field, southeast down the Wheatfield Road, the Confederates were finally able to sweep the Federals out of the extremely hard-fought Wheatfield. With this accomplished, a coalition of remnant Confederate forces from Joseph Kershaw's, Paul Semmes, and George T. Anderson's brigade emerged from the Wheatfield and Rose Woods onto Houck's Ridge. Just to their left, Wofford's brigade advanced eastward generally between the Wheatfield Road and Trossel Lane. Where Longstreet intended Wofford's brigade to attack has been the source of some consternation over the years. While an argument could be made for the existence of more opportune places for this brigade's attack, perhaps in support of Barksdale's brigade as it made its push from the Peach Orchard toward Cemetery Ridge, we will not descend into armchair generalship here. In his memoirs, Longstreet explained his in-the-moment rationale for sending Wofford where he did. Longstreet wrote, quote, "We had carried Devil's Den, were at the Round Tops in the Wheatfield, but Romney and Ayres' division of regulars and James Barnes' division were holding us in equal battle. The struggle throughout the field seemed at its tension. The brigades of R.H. Anderson's division could hold off other troops of Hancock's, but were not strong enough to step to the enemy's lines. When John Caldwell's division was pushed away, Ayres' flank and the gorge at Little Round Top were only covered by a sharp line of picket men behind the boulders. If we could drive in the sharpshooters and strike Ayres' flank to advantage, we could dislodge his and Barnes' divisions, occupy the gorge behind George Sykes' brigades on Round Top, force them to retreat, and lift our desperate fighters to the summit. I had one brigade, Wofford's, that had not been engaged in the hottest battle. To urge the troops to the reserve power in the precious moments, I rode with Wofford," unquote. It's Longstreet. Simply put, by 7:30 p.m., Longstreet's designated target on this portion of the field was, as the map indicates, the gorge, as he called it, at Little Round Top. Longstreet's identification of this location as the intended target for Wofford's brigade and the Kershaw-Semmes-Anderson coalition elicits a few observations. First, it indicates, as previously mentioned, just how much the rightward drift effect initiated on the extreme Confederate right with Law's brigade had affected Longstreet's attack. By 7:30 p.m., we have 7 of Longstreet's 8 brigades located along or south of the Wheatfield Road, nowhere near the Confederates' primary objective for the day, Cemetery Hill. Second, it underscores the extent to which Longstreet's attack lacked a well-informed plan, one developed and refined well before it commenced, despite the Confederate High Command's best efforts to produce such a plan. Rather, it was largely executed on the fly, requiring last-minute alterations due to the unforeseen presence of Sickles's command stretching from the Emmitsburg Road Ridge to Devil's Den and beyond. Third, it again underscores the Confederates' severe handicap in lacking rearward support. While Confederates on this portion of the field finally managed to achieve some forward momentum and success at the Wheatfield, they had no fresh reinforcements at their disposal to follow up that success. And fourth, through effective use of their interior lines, the exact opposite held true for the Union Army in this sector and other sectors on July 2nd. Whereas with the advance of Wofford's brigade, Longstreet had committed all his available troops to the fight, the Union High Command was able to flood this area with additional fresh troops. Thus, when the Confederates attempted to push forward toward the gorge at Little Round Top, they were almost immediately checked by Brigadier General Samuel Crawford's fresh 5th Corps Division of Pennsylvania Reserves, along with portions of the completely fresh 6th Corps under Major General John Sedgwick. Additionally, as was the case with the last map we looked at, a better title for this one might have been Confederate Concert of Action Part 2, since by this point in the Confederate attack, Ewell's lack of simultaneous support was fully manifesting itself on Longstreet's front. The key word here is simultaneous. Although Ewell's corps was ordered to make a simultaneous demonstration to be converted into a real attack to preclude the Federals from shifting units from their right to their left to blunt Longstreet, Ewell ultimately did little until after the First Corps attack was ending. Confederate Second Corps Division Commander Edward Johnson did not initiate his attack against Culp's Hill until sometime between 7 and 7:30 p.m., while Jubal Early, commanding another Second Corps Division, did not send 2 of his brigades against East Cemetery Hill until near 8 p.m., both actions commencing hours after Longstreet's assault began. And with that, let's move into the last day of the battle. We're going to talk about Lee's plans for July 3rd. Notice I said plans and not plan. The 6th map moves us forward to the 3rd day of the battle. It depicts a frequently overlooked, albeit critical issue on the Confederate side in the early morning hours of July 3rd, that being that Lee's initial plan to resume the Confederate tactical offensive on the southern end of the field would neither have been directed at the Federal center nor led by Pickett's division. The typical criticisms of Longstreet's performance at this stage of the battle mainly revolve around 2 things. First, the supposed orders he received in the overnight hours to prepare to attack at daylight and in concert with Ewell's corps. And second, Longstreet's overnight contemplation to possibly resume his attack not from his front, but in a move around the Round Tops. On the first score, realistically, all we know about Lee's intentions for July 3rd are found in one of his official battle reports, where he noted how the general plan was unchanged, it's his words, from the second day's fight, and how, quote, Longstreet, reinforced by Pickett's 3 brigades, was ordered to attack the next morning, and General Ewell was directed to assail the enemy's right at the same time, unquote. Despite several post-war writers and historians' claims over the years, there is not one shred of corroborated evidence that Lee ordered Longstreet to be prepared to attack at daylight on July 3rd. Some point to some details in one post-war account from Longstreet's principal artillery officer at Gettysburg, Colonel Edward Porter E.P. Alexander, in an attempt to prove Longstreet received orders. However, not only are there substantive issues with that particular account from E.P. Alexander, but in Alexander's other major post-war work, he writes plainly, quote, Edward Johnson had been ordered by Ewell to attack at daylight, under the impression that Longstreet would attack at the same hour. In fact, however, Longstreet received no orders during the night, and the troops required for his attack could not be gotten into their positions before noon, unquote. Furthermore, not one aide, staff officer, or other member of the Confederate High Command ever produced any documentation or recollected any particulars concerning this alleged overnight order. It's important to remember that when engaging in the historical trade, we're beholden to documented proof or corroborative evidence before advancing an assertion. There is neither here. Lee and Longstreet's meeting on Seminary Ridge around 4:30 a.m. on July 3rd also presents a serious issue to the allegation that Longstreet was expected to resume the attack around daylight. The general location where this meeting is thought to have taken place is distinctly marked on the map. You can see it there on Seminary Ridge. It was at this early morning meeting when Lee, for the first time, broached his initial July 3rd plan with Longstreet. This initial plan consisted of the following. A resumed attack over much of the same hard-fought ground Longstreet's men had engaged on July 2nd, the Federal left center, with the battered divisions of Hood, now under Law, and McLaws again leading the attack, with Pickett's division in support. Longstreet pushed back on this initial plan, explaining to Lee how Hood's and McLaws' division held the Army's right flank, and if they attacked and happened to be repulsed, the Confederates would likely find their flank seriously weakened and open to a possible counterattack. As one of his official reports indicates, Lee saw the merit in Longstreet's input and scrapped much of his initial plan, only to then propose an entirely new one. This second plan was for Longstreet to lead an attack on the Federal center using Pickett's division and some units from A.P. Hill's Third Corps, namely Heath's division, now under James Johnston Pettigrew due to Heath's wounding on July 1st, and 2 brigades from William Dorsey Pender's division, initially under James Lane, then Isaac Tremble, due to Pender's wounding on July 2nd. With this second plan, which was the one ultimately adopted, Lee not only changed the point of attack from the Federal left center to the center, but also the units that would make up the attacking column. No longer would the men be entirely from Longstreet's corps, but they would now be from both Longstreet's and Hill's corps. These 2 decisions were extremely consequential, since changing the point of attack and transitioning to a cross-corps effort meant only one principal thing: delay. Planning and preparing for any large-scale attack requires a substantial amount of time. Doing the same for a cross-corps attack necessitates even more careful coordination between officers up and down the chain of command. If Lee had been particularly worried about attacking early on July 3rd, or attacking in concert with Ewell, who, by the way, did not initiate an attack from the Confederate right on the early morning of July 3rd, but was instead attacked by the Federals, then the adoption of this second plan was certainly not going to help matters. Indeed, as events turned out, Lee and Longstreet would spend the remainder of the morning hours planning what became known as the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble attack. The second topic this map directly addresses is Longstreet's alternate plan to attack around the Round Tops on July 3rd. Longstreet proposed this plan at his 4:30 a.m. meeting with Lee and had apparently been reconnoitering and planning for such a move throughout the overnight hours. On this topic, it's important to recognize that Longstreet was not proposing the same move he had suggested on the evening of July 1st and morning of July 2nd. That being, at that time, for the entire Confederate Army to redeploy to advantageous ground between the Union Army and Washington and Baltimore, where it might pursue the tactical defensive and receive a Federal attack. Rather, this time, Longstreet demonstrated an understanding that Lee expected a resumption of the tactical offensive at Gettysburg and was proposing moving around the Round Tops to attack the Federal left and rear. 2 different plans there we're talking about. Longstreet critics have frequently pointed to his alternate proposal and planning for such a move as concrete proof that by this point in the battle, Longstreet had lost all sense of self-control as a professional soldier and was engaging in unfettered insubordination. When assessed independently, untethered from Lee's alleged overnight order for Longstreet to be prepared to attack around daylight, Longstreet's alternate proposal appears much less dramatic and nefarious and more in line with Lee's and Longstreet's typical working relationship. The First Corps commander understood Lee's broad directive in the overnight hours, that he intended to resume the offensive at Gettysburg on July 3rd. So Longstreet investigated a possible way to resume such an attack. When Longstreet presented Lee with this proposal at their Seminary Ridge meeting and was turned down, the primary source record suggests the generals then moved on to a discussion about Lee's initial plan against the Federal left center, followed by his second plan to attack the Federal center. The supposed insubordinate nature of Longstreet's overnight activities on the extreme Confederate right are even further negated upon recognizing that Longstreet included mention of his alternate proposal in some detail in his official battle report for Lee and ultimately everyone else to read. Longstreet wrote in his July 27, 1863 report the following, quote, "On the following morning, July 3rd, our arrangements were made for renewing the attack by my right, with a view to pass around the hill occupied by the enemy on his left, and to gain it by flank and reverse attack. This would have been a slow process, probably, but I think not very difficult. A few moments after my orders for the execution of this plan were given, the commanding general joined me and ordered a column of attack to be formed of Pickett's, Heath's, and part of Pender's divisions, the assault to be made directly at the enemy's main position, the Cemetery Hill. Last map here we're going to cover here this evening. We're going to go into a bit of detail on Pickett's charge. This last map depicting Pickett's charge, otherwise known as the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble attack, was included as a tool to make some observations about Longstreet's assault, pointing out a few aspects that went well for the Confederates and several that did not. To lead off, one aspect that certainly did not go well for the Confederates were the units Lee chose to participate in the attack. The Confederate attacking column was made up of approximately 12,500 men, including 3 fresh brigades, 5,830 men from Pickett's division of Longstreet's Corps. However, on Pickett's left, Lee chose the 4 brigades of Henry Heath's division, now under Brigadier General James Johnston Pettigrew. Unlike Pickett's men, Heath's were in no way fresh on the morning of July 3rd, having been heavily engaged on July 1st. For example, anchoring Pettigrew's left flank was Heath's old brigade under Colonel John M. Brockenbrough, which was said to have only mustered somewhere between 200 and 600 men fit for duty on July 3rd. Likewise, 2 units from Pender's division, Alfred Scales' brigade, now under Colonel William Lawrence, and James Lane's brigade were chosen for the assault. These 2 brigades were initially under Lane's overall command, but of all times to do so, were handed over to Major General Isaac Trimble during mid-preparation on the morning of July 3rd. Both these brigades had also seen action on July 1st, especially Scales's brigade, which took part in the Confederate assault on Seminary Ridge on the afternoon of July 1st. The condition of Scales' brigade on the morning of July 3rd was apparently so dire that when Lee rode over to examine Trimble's line, he was said to admit, quote, "Many of these poor boys should go to the rear. They are not able for duty," unquote. Despite Lee's apparent recognition of this fact, Scales' brigade joined the attack anyway. Other units from A.P. Hill's command that had seen very little action on July 1st and 2nd were available in the immediate vicinity. For example, William Mahone's, Abner Perrin's, Edward Thomas's brigades. Yet for whatever reason, they were left out. Another not so opportune aspect of the Confederate charge was the 400-yard gap separating Pickett's and Pettigrew's division at the onset and readily seen on the map. In addition, Pettigrew's division was positioned about 200 yards behind Pickett's. Even though these gaps were not advantageous, they were necessary. McMillan Woods, where Pettigrew's division was positioned prior to the charge, was the only location to Pickett's left that offered some degree of concealment and cover. Furthermore, one of the Confederate successes during the charge, as the map also shows, was the effective and skillful closing of these gaps during the advance. To accomplish this, Pickett's division had to execute a series of left obliques on its way toward Cemetery Ridge to eliminate the horizontal gap between Richard Garnett's brigade of his own division and James Archer's brigade under Colonel Burkett D. Fry of Pettigrew's. The time Pickett's division spent executing these obliques also eliminated the vertical 200-yard gap between his and Pettigrew's division. Lee, Longstreet, Pickett, Garnett, and Fry discussed the execution of this move extensively before the charge, and it paid off greatly during the assault, since Pickett's left and Pettigrew's right met up near perfectly toward the latter stages of the advance. The third aspect this map addresses is the age-old question of supporting units. Worth saying up front is that no, there was not a so-called second wave of Confederate brigades waiting in the wings to follow up the initial attacking column. When one scours Lee's official battle reports for details about what he intended for reinforcement, most of his commentary concerns advanced artillery support behind or on the flanks of the attacking column. We know Longstreet was aware of Lee's expectation for this advanced artillery support, since we have written record of Longstreet reminding E.P. Alexander about the need for it in the lead up to the attack. Coupled with the impracticality of advanced artillery support, as Alexander explained in detail in the postwar years, At least two major blunders inhibited any such plan from being carried out, both of which were largely caused by the Army's Chief of Artillery, William Pendleton. First, prior to the charge, Pendleton sent the artillery reserve too far to the rear to be of any use, precluding Confederate gunners from replenishing their ammunition before the assault commenced. Second, just before the infantry stepped off, Pendleton proceeded to move a collection of 12-pounder howitzers that Alexander had planned to advance with the infantry. Besides advanced artillery support, there's very little commentary in Lee's official reports about other supporting units. Lee never once specifically identifies a brigade or brigades that he expected to support the attack. Despite what many alleged in the post-war years, the remainder of Longstreet's corps, Hood's, and McLaws' battered divisions had already been eliminated as potential candidates. During their 4:30 a.m. meeting, Longstreet had convinced Lee of the need to keep Hood and McLaws where they were, holding the Army's right flank. Concerning the remainder of Hill's corps, Lee himself only wrote, quote, General Hill was directed to hold his line with the rest of his command, afford General Longstreet further assistance if required, and avail himself of any success that might be gained, unquote. So Hill was only expected to provide additional support if he thought the situation required it, or if the initial attacking column achieved some kind of visible success against the Federal position. Confirming the contents of Lee's report is Hill's own contention made to his adjutant, William H. Palmer, that he apparently begged, that's Hill's words, to use his whole corps in the attack, but Lee apparently, quote, refused and said, what remains of your corps will be my only reserve, and it will be needed if General Longstreet's attack should fail, unquote. Much, perhaps too much, has been made of the brigades of Cadmus Wilcox and David Lang on July 3rd. These brigades have been beaten up during their attack over much of the same ground the day previous. Even though Wilcox and Lang were positioned to Pickett's immediate right and front, on the west side of the Emmitsburg Road and to the left of the Joseph Sherfy farm in the lead up to the July 3rd assault, there's no evidence the Confederate High Command intended these approximately 1,700 men to be part of the initial attacking column. Furthermore, an alleged conversation during the charge between Longstreet and one of Pickett's staffers, Captain Robert A. Bright, suggests Longstreet was completely aware Wilcox and Lang had not advanced with Pickett. Toward the latter stages of his advance, Pickett sent Bright rearward to expressly ask Longstreet for reinforcements. During his exchange with Bright, Longstreet demonstrated his awareness of Wilcox's then idle state by allegedly pointing and telling Bright that Wilcox was located in that peach orchard, and Pickett could request his assistance if needed. This Pickett proceeded to do several times. However, when Wilcox and Lang ultimately advanced, they could not locate Pickett's men. Instead of marching off to the left, as Pickett had done, they advanced straight ahead, soon experiencing the deadly effects of a withering Federal artillery fire, along with flanking fire from Brigadier General George Stannard's Vermonters, before retreating from whence they came. Finally, last point on this map, it depicts at least some of the major reasons why the Confederate attack failed on July 3rd. On Pettigrew's front, both Joseph Davis's and Brockenbrough's brigade were delayed in their advance toward Cemetery Ridge. So while the rest of the division was on the move, these two brigades lagged well behind. Davis's men eventually caught up. However, Brockenbrough's brigade only managed to make it about halfway between Seminary and Cemetery Ridge. Longstreet saw the trouble with Brockenbrough's brigade and the developing threat to the assault's left flank early on, so he sent two aides to warn Pettigrew and Trimble. Neither aide found Pettigrew nor Trimble. However, one of them managed to make it through to inform James Lane in what ultimately proved a fruitless venture, as Lane was unable to coordinate an effectual adjustment to meet the Federal flanking threat. With a few exceptions, the majority of Pettigrew's and Trimble's command made it only as far as the Emmitsburg roadbed. Effective Federal artillery fire from Cemetery Hill, musketry fire from Alexander Hayes' 2nd Corps Division in its front, and flanking fire from the 8th Ohio and 126 New York regiments on its left collectively wreaked havoc on Pettigrew and Trimble's attack. Pickett's divisions scarcely fared better, though Pickett was able to achieve very limited and short-lived success. along the Federals' advance line near the angle, much of his charge melted away in the ground between the Emmitsburg Road and the low stone wall proceeding in front of the copse of trees. As was the case on Pettigrew and Trimble's front, Federal artillery fire had a significant adverse effect, while flanking fire from Stannard's Vermonters chipped away at Pickett's right. Indeed, Stannard's move not only resulted in Brigadier General James Kemper's wounding, serving to break down command cohesion, but it forced Kemper's brigade to increasingly bunch to its left, disorganizing its own ranks and causing crowding into Garnett's brigade and Lewis Armstead's advance from the rear, not to mention compelling Kemper to expend 2 of his 5 regiments, the 11th and 24th Virginia, to protect his right. In addition, and perhaps most consequential in causing the Confederate failure, was the Union Army's ability to quickly mobilize and concentrate supporting units and reinforcements to address any threats or temporary breakthroughs in their advance line. In the end, perhaps George Pickett himself, when asked in the postwar years about what caused the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble attack to fail, was most correct when he responded, quote, "I've always thought the Yankees had something to do with it," unquote. Following his 1887 article in Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, it would be another 9 years before Longstreet published something on Gettysburg for public consumption. In 1896, however, his memoir From Manassas to Appomattox was published. In its section on the second day's battle at Gettysburg, Longstreet advanced a curious observation about the state of the controversy concerning his actions at the battle 33 years ago. Under ordinary circumstances, he wrote, this account of the second day made from the records would be complete and conclusive. Nevertheless, he recognized that as Longstreet, that would not be the case. He observed, quote, the Battle of Gettysburg, which may be called the epitome of the war, has been the subject of many contentions of words, referring to his detractors' pronouncements and writings since 1872. He dubbed these detractors the Knights of the Quill, charging them with, quote, consuming many of their peaceful hours in publishing, through books, periodicals, and newspapers, their plans for the battle, endeavoring to forestall the records and to find a scapegoat, unquote. Their plans for the battle. An exceedingly accurate way of describing the origins of nearly all the anti-Longstreet cabals, post-war allegations against Longstreet's Gettysburg performance. Their plans for the battle, which they subsequently and falsely ascribed to General Lee, such as the Sunrise attack claim, the High Command's supposed recognition of Little Round Top as the key position on the southern end of the field, and the charge that Longstreet was supposed to be prepared to attack at daylight on the 3rd. While on the whole, his detractors' allegations were indeed uncorroborated, unfortunately for Longstreet, Gettysburg historiography, and historical memory of the battle, many of these claims were perpetuated by several high-profile historians well into the 20th century, and to some extent into the 21st, even up to the present day. Perhaps if some scholar of repute had earlier taken up Longstreet's 1887 suggestion that a volume of distinct maps be produced to make a demonstration to the letter of all its features, and to address the distorted and misrepresented facts connected with this battle, as Longstreet put it, the controversy would have been shortened, or at the very least tempered, beyond its heretofore 151-year scope. As evidence in this collection of 7 distinct maps to address several touch points of the Longstreet-Gettysburg controversy, perhaps Longstreet had a valid point in 1887, and with the help of some limited narration, prove there is indeed truth in the popular expression that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much for having me here this evening. I'll take any questions you have.